In a quiet, dimly lit courtroom, a case was unfolding like any other, until a boy's innocent words sent shockwaves through the room. "Your Honor, I'm hungry." At first glance, David seemed like just another child caught in the gears of an uncaring system. But what followed would reveal hidden truths, unimaginable decisions, and a twist that would leave everyone questioning their own assumptions about justice and humanity. Judge George Wilkins, known for his stern demeanor and unyielding adherence to the law, was faced with a choice that day. The decision he made wasn't just about David. It exposed cracks in a system meant to protect the innocent, leaving a legacy that would change lives forever. This isn't just a story about a boy asking for food. It's about the power of compassion, the weight of responsibility, and how one moment can alter the course of countless lives. But beware, there's more to this tale than meets the eye. Stay with us as we uncover the gripping and unexpected twists in the story of Black Boy Tells White Judge He's Hungry. His response will shock you. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more incredible stories like this. Your support helps us bring narratives that not only entertain, but also provoke thought and inspire change. Now, let's dive into today's tale. The courtroom buzzed with routine activity. Lawyers shuffled papers, a bailiff called out names, and the faint hum of whispers filled the air. Judge George Wilkins sat at the bench, his face a mask of authority as he presided over the day's docket. In the middle of this mundane rhythm, the door creaked open, and a young boy entered hesitantly. David, no older than 10, clutched a worn backpack to his chest. His clothes were slightly oversized, as though they had been handed down several times before reaching him. "David Turner," the clerk called. David stepped forward, his small frame dwarfed by the courtroom's imposing architecture. He didn't have a lawyer or a guardian by his side. All eyes turned to him, some with curiosity, others with pity. The judge's voice cut through the silence. "Where are your parents, son?" David hesitated, his voice barely audible. "They couldn't come, Your Honor." Judge Wilkins frowned, but motioned for the boy to approach. "Why are you here, then?" David shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room before settling on the judge. I just wanted to tell you something." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. A few people chuckled, assuming this was a prank or a mistake. The bailiff took a step forward, but the judge raised his hand to stop him. "What is it, son?" David looked down at his worn sneakers, then back up at the judge. "I'm hungry." The room fell silent. The weight of those two words sinking in like a stone dropped into still water. Judge Wilkins leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me?" David swallowed hard. "I haven't eaten in 2 days, Your Honor." The murmurs started again, but this time they were different, tinged with disbelief and unease. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, and even the lawyers seemed at a loss for words. Wilkins tapped his gavel once, restoring order. His gaze never left the boy. "Step closer, David," he said, his voice softer now. "Tell me more." David walked up to the stand, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly cavernous room. He explained haltingly about his family's struggles, their eviction, and how they had been living in their car. The courtroom listened in stunned silence. But as David spoke, Judge Wilkins noticed something odd. The boy kept glancing toward the corner of the room, where an old clock ticked steadily. Wilkins followed his gaze, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, an inexplicable chill ran down his spine. The boy finished his story, and the judge leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. He knew this case was unlike any he'd handled before, and something about that clock, something he couldn't quite put his finger on, made him feel that this case was about to take a turn no one could predict. The courtroom remained eerily silent, the weight of David's words hanging in the air. Judge Wilkins glanced at the boy, then at the stack of case files before him. This wasn't a case, it was a cry for help. Yet it wasn't on the docket, and the judicial system wasn't built for moments like this. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "David," he began, his tone measured, "this is highly unusual. I need to understand. Why come to me? Why not a shelter or someone else?" David hesitated, his small hands gripping the edge of the podium. "Because I heard you're fair," he said simply. And I thought, maybe you'd listen. The simplicity of the statement struck Wilkins harder than any legal argument he'd ever heard. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together. Do you have any family? Anyone who can help? David shook his head. Just my mom, but she's working 2 jobs. She tries, but it's not enough. I just thought maybe you'd know what to do. The judge's stern facade softened, but before he could respond, the bailiff stepped forward. Your Honor, he whispered, should I escort the boy out? This isn't protocol. Wilkins raised a hand to silence him. No, let him stay. He looked back at David. Do you know how serious this is, son? You've walked into a courtroom, interrupted proceedings. That's not something people take lightly. David nodded, his eyes wide with understanding. Yes, sir, but I didn't know where else to go. Wilkins sat back, the room still and expectant. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him, waiting for his decision. The boy's plight was painfully real, yet this was no place for it. He was a judge, not a social worker. But something about David's gaze, earnest and unwavering, made him pause. As the judge mulled over his options, the ticking of the old clock grew louder, almost unnaturally so. Wilkins glanced at it again, frowning. The hands of the clock seemed slower, almost as if time itself was hesitating. Your Honor, a lawyer at one of the tables spoke up, his voice cutting through the tension. If I may, this isn't the time or place for such matters. We have real cases to address. The judge's eyes narrowed. Thank you, counselor, but I'll decide what's appropriate in my courtroom. He turned back to David, the boy's small frame standing resolute before him. All right, he said finally. I'll help you. But first, I need to understand everything. We'll take a recess, and you'll tell me exactly what's going on. The room erupted into whispers again as Wilkins rapped his gavel. Court is adjourned for a brief recess, he announced. He stood, his gaze lingering on the boy for a moment longer. Come with me, David. As they left the courtroom together, the tension in the air shifted, replaced by a strange, unspoken anticipation. Those left behind exchanged uneasy glances, many glancing toward the old clock. It was as if everyone could feel it. Something bigger was happening, something none of them could quite explain. Judge Wilkins led David through a side door of the courtroom into his private chambers. The room, adorned with shelves of legal books and heavy wooden furniture, exuded authority. Yet, at this moment, it felt like the weight of the world rested on Wilkins' shoulders. Sit down, David, the judge said, motioning to a chair opposite his desk. The boy perched on the edge of the seat, his feet barely touching the ground, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Wilkins sat down and studied the boy for a moment. His clothes were clean but worn, his shoes scuffed and slightly too small. It was clear that every effort had been made to present himself as respectful, even in the midst of hardship. All right, Wilkins began, leaning forward. I need you to tell me everything. Start from the beginning. What brought you here today? David swallowed hard and nodded. It started a few weeks ago, he said quietly. Mom lost one of her jobs. She works hard, but it's not enough. Some days, we don't have enough to eat. I try to help, but I'm just a kid. Wilkins nodded, encouraging him to continue. What kind of help did you try to find? David's eyes welled up with tears, though he fought to keep them from falling. I asked our neighbors, but they're struggling too. I tried to get a job, but nobody hires someone my age. Did you reach out to any local charities or food banks? Wilkins asked, his tone gentle. David nodded again. We did. They gave us some food, but it only lasted a little while. Mom's too proud to keep asking. She says we can't rely on other people forever. Wilkins frowned, his mind racing. The boy's story was all too familiar. In small towns like theirs, resources were often limited, and pride sometimes stood in the way of asking for help. David, he said, his voice firm but kind, you showed a lot of courage coming here today. But the courtroom isn't a place where we typically solve these kinds of problems. Why me? Why not your school or another adult in your life? David hesitated, his fingers tightening around each other. I've seen you on TV, he admitted. When you became judge, you said you wanted to make this town better for everyone. I thought maybe you could help us. Wilkins' chest tightened at the boy's words. He had indeed made that promise during his swearing-in ceremony. But like many in his position, he quickly found himself buried under the weight of the system. Before he could respond, there was a knock at the door. The bailiff stepped in, his face etched with concern. "Your Honor, the next case is waiting. How long should we hold them?" Wilkins waved him off. "I need time, John. Tell them we'll resume when I say so." The bailiff hesitated, then nodded and closed the door. Wilkins turned back to David, who was watching him with wide, hopeful eyes. "David," he said slowly, "I'm going to help you, but I need to understand more. What do you and your mom need right now?" The boy didn't hesitate. "Food. Just enough to get us through until she finds another job. And maybe someone to help us figure things out." Wilkins leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He couldn't just hand over money. It wasn't ethical, and it wouldn't solve the underlying issues. But he also couldn't turn a blind eye. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint ticking of the antique clock on the wall. The sound was steady, almost rhythmic, yet it seemed louder than usual. Wilkins glanced at the clock, an odd feeling creeping up his spine. Shaking off the thought, he leaned forward again. "All right, David, here's what we're going to do. I'll make some calls and see what resources are available. But you have to promise me something." David's eyes widened. "Anything, sir. You have to stay strong," Wilkins said firmly. "For your mom, for yourself. And you have to trust that there are people who care enough to help." David nodded solemnly. "I will. Thank you, Your Honor." As Wilkins escorted David back to the courtroom lobby, a strange tension lingered in the air. It wasn't just the weight of the boy's story. It was something more. The old clock in his chambers, usually reliable, had started ticking irregularly. And for the first time in years, Wilkins felt a nagging sense of unease he couldn't explain. As Judge Wilkins resumed his duties in the courtroom that afternoon, David's story lingered in his mind. It was a stark reminder of the growing cracks in Crestview's facade. On the surface, the town seemed picturesque, a tight-knit community with smiling faces and tree-lined streets. But beneath the surface, there were struggles few dared to acknowledge. That evening, Wilkins sat at his desk at home, staring at his computer screen. He was poring over local records, trying to piece together a broader picture of the town's struggles. Requests for public assistance had risen sharply in the past year. Food bank supplies were stretched thin, and homelessness, though hidden, was on the rise. As he leaned back in his chair, his eyes fell on a photograph on his desk, a picture of his family. His late wife had been the heart of their home, always championing causes for those in need. Her voice echoed in his mind. "If you have the power to help, you don't just sit there. You do something." He sighed and reached for his phone. The first call he made was to the local food bank. "This is Judge Wilkins," he said, introducing himself. "I need to know the state of your supplies." "How bad is it?" The volunteer on the other end hesitated before answering. "It's not great, Judge. Donations are down, and the demand has doubled. We're doing our best, but we've had to turn people away." Wilkins felt a pang of guilt. He'd been so focused on his courtroom duties that he hadn't noticed how dire the situation had become. "I'll see what I can do," he promised before hanging up. The next call was to Crestview Elementary, where David was a student. The school counselor, Mrs. Harper, picked up, her tone cautious. "Is everything all right, Your Honor?" "It's about one of your students, David Mathis," Wilkins began. "I met him today in court. He told me his family is struggling. I need to know if there are any programs or resources he's been connected with." Mrs. Harper sighed heavily. "David is one of our brightest students, but he's been through so much. His mom works 2 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. We've tried to help through our free lunch program and holiday donations, but it's not enough. He's not the only one either. There are dozens of kids like him." Wilkins thanked her and ended the call, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just about David. This was about an entire community that had been left to fend for itself. He needed a plan, and he needed it quickly. That night, as the town slept, Wilkins began drafting an initiative to address the growing needs of Crestview's vulnerable residents. He called it the Bridge Project, a program aimed at connecting struggling families with resources, jobs, and community support. It was ambitious, but Wilkins knew it was necessary. The following morning, as he reviewed his notes over coffee, A sense of unease crept back into his mind. Something about David's story didn't add up. Why had the boy come to him specifically? Out of all the people and places he could have turned to, why the courthouse? Wilkins couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the boy's tale than met the eye. And as the clock struck 9 a.m., its ticking unusually loud, he realized this case might be the start of something far larger and far stranger than he'd anticipated. The day after David's unexpected visit, Judge Wilkins arrived at the courthouse with a strange sense of anticipation. His mind was restless, consumed by questions about the boy's struggles and the broader issues plaguing Crestview. Yet, beneath the surface, there was something else, a nagging feeling that he couldn't quite place. By mid-morning, his clerk, Emma, stepped into his office with a hesitant expression. "Your Honor, there's something you need to see," she said, handing him a thin file. "It's about David Mathis." Wilkins opened the file, skimming the sparse documentation. It contained basic information, David's age, his address, his school. But one detail stood out, a small, handwritten note at the bottom of the page. Known to frequent the abandoned Bramble Street Church. Rumored to be seeking help for his family. The Bramble Street Church? Wilkins frowned. That place has been closed for years. Why would he go there? Emma shrugged. "I'm not sure, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Maybe someone in the neighborhood can tell you more." Wilkins nodded, his curiosity deepening. That afternoon, after his court sessions, he decided to visit Bramble Street. The abandoned church loomed at the end of the quiet street, its weathered facade and broken stained glass windows standing as a haunting reminder of Crestview's forgotten history. Wilkins parked his car and stepped out, feeling a strange chill despite the warm sunlight. He approached cautiously, pushing open the creaking wooden door. The interior was dim, with shafts of light streaming through cracks in the walls. Dust motes floated in the air, and the scent of decay lingered. As he walked further inside, he noticed faint traces of activity. Empty food wrappers, a worn blanket, and a small notebook lying on one of the pews. Picking up the notebook, he saw David's name scrawled on the inside cover. Flipping through the pages, Wilkins discovered crude sketches of people and places, along with fragmented sentences. "Need to find him. They don't understand. It wasn't an accident." The last phrase sent a shiver down his spine. What wasn't an accident? Suddenly, a noise from the back of the church made him freeze. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate. "Who's there?" Wilkins called, his voice echoing through the empty space. No response, just the sound of retreating steps growing fainter. Wilkins hurried to the source of the noise, but by the time he reached the back door, whoever had been there was gone. He stepped outside, scanning the overgrown yard. The air was eerily still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Wilkins glanced down and noticed a single, fresh footprint in the dirt, larger than David's, and unmistakably from a man's boot. Back at home, Wilkins couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. He placed the notebook on his desk and stared at it for a long moment before flipping to the last page. There in shaky handwriting was another cryptic message. "He knows." The word sent a jolt of fear through him. Who was he? And what did he know? Wilkins leaned back, his mind racing. David's plea for help had seemed straightforward at first. A hungry boy seeking aid for his struggling family. But now, it felt like the boy was caught in something far more complex. He thought back to the courthouse, to the boy's demeanor. David had seemed frightened, but not just of hunger or hardship. No, this was something deeper, something darker. Wilkins resolved to dig deeper into the town's history and its forgotten corners. Someone or something was trying to stay hidden, and David Mathis, whether he realized it or not, was at the center of it all. The following morning, Judge Wilkins was already at his desk when his phone buzzed. It was an anonymous text message, the kind he never received. The message was short but unsettling. "Stay away from the church. You don't know what you're dealing with." Wilkins stared at the screen, his heart pounding. The abandoned church wasn't just a forgotten relic of Crestview's past. It was connected to something, or someone, who wanted its secrets to remain buried. Determined, he decided to dig deeper into David's life and the mysterious events surrounding the boy. He pulled up property records, police reports, and old newspaper archives, anything that might shed light on what was happening in Crestview. What he uncovered shocked him. The Bramble Street Church had been the site of a notorious incident nearly 2 decades earlier. According to a faded news clipping, a fire had engulfed the building during a community event, claiming the lives of several attendees, including a local pastor and his family. The official report ruled it an accident caused by faulty wiring, but whispers of foul play had lingered in the community. Rumors of corruption, hidden money, and vengeance surrounded the tragedy, though none of it was ever proven. Wilkins leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. Could the events of the past still haunt Crestview? And how was David connected to all of this? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Emma, holding a thin manila folder. "This just came in," she said, placing it on his desk. "It's the report you requested on David Mathis." Wilkins opened the folder and scanned its contents. The report detailed David's family history, painting a grim picture. His father had disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances. His mother, struggling to make ends meet, had fallen ill, leaving David to fend for himself. One line stood out. David has been seen speaking to an unidentified man in a black coat near the church. Wilkins frowned. "Unidentified man?" Emma nodded. "A neighbor reported it, but no one's been able to figure out who he is. The man seems to appear and vanish without a trace." Wilkins felt a chill run down his spine. Was this the same man who had left the footprint at the church? Later that day, Wilkins decided to pay David's home a visit. The boy's modest house was on the edge of town, its peeling paint and sagging roof a testament to years of neglect. As Wilkins approached, he noticed someone lingering near the front yard. It was a man in a black coat, tall and imposing, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. "Excuse me," Wilkins called out, but the man turned and walked briskly away, disappearing into a nearby alley. Wilkins chased after him, but by the time he rounded the corner, the man was gone. All that remained was an unsettling silence and the faint scent of smoke in the air. Returning to the house, Wilkins knocked on the door. David answered, his eyes widening in surprise. "Judge Wilkins?" the boy asked, his voice trembling. "I need to talk to you, David," Wilkins said gently. "It's important." David hesitated but stepped aside to let him in. The house was sparse, its air thick with a mix of mildew and desperation. "David, I need you to tell me the truth," Wilkins said, kneeling to meet the boy's gaze. "Who is the man in the black coat? Why do you go to the church?" David's lip quivered, and he looked away. "I can't," he whispered. "You can trust me," Wilkins said. "I promise I'll help you." The boy looked at him, tears welling in his eyes. "He told me not to say anything. He said something bad will happen if I do." Wilkins felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "David, who is he? What does he want?" David shook his head, his voice barely audible. "He knows about my dad." The mention of David's father sent a shockwave through Wilkins. Was the man in the black coat connected to the father's disappearance? Was this why David was so frightened? As the boy sat silently, Wilkins made a silent vow. He would get to the bottom of this, no matter how deep or dark the truth might be. As he left the house, Wilkins glanced back at the alley where the man had vanished. The faint scent of smoke still lingered, a ghostly reminder that this was far from over. The next day, Judge Wilkins stood in front of the abandoned Bramble Street Church, its charred facade looming against the pale morning sky. The scent of decay and ash filled the air, and the overgrown weeds whispered in the light breeze. Despite the years of neglect, the building held an unshakable presence, as if it refused to let the past fade away. Armed with a flashlight and a determination to uncover the truth, Wilkins stepped inside. The warped wooden floor creaked under his weight, and shards of broken stained glass lay scattered like forgotten memories. As he shone the flashlight around, his beam caught faint scorch marks stretching across the walls. "This place still carries its scars," Wilkins muttered, his voice echoing. An unexpected find. Near the altar, he noticed something unusual, a cluster of footprints in the dust, all leading to a trapdoor he hadn't seen before. His pulse quickened. Crouching, he examined the area. The door's edges were blackened, but the wood itself seemed newer than the rest of the building. With a groan of effort, Wilkins pried it open. The air that escaped was heavy and damp, carrying a metallic tang. Below was a staircase leading into darkness. Gripping his flashlight tightly, he descended into the unknown. The temperature dropped with each step, and the walls closed in, giving way to a small underground chamber. In the center of the room stood a lone wooden crate. Its surface was etched with symbols Wilkins didn't recognize, and a single envelope rested atop it. He hesitated before opening the envelope. Inside was a photograph of a man who looked hauntingly familiar. It was David's father. The mystery deepens. Wilkins' mind raced. David's father had been missing for years. What was his picture doing here, in a place tied to an event that had devastated the town decades ago? And why had no one ever spoken about this chamber? He flipped the photo over, revealing a handwritten note. "Trust no one. He's watching." Wilkins felt a chill run down his spine. The words seemed to reach out of the past, warning him of something or someone still at large. Suddenly, a faint sound echoed above him. Footsteps. Wilkins froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He quickly turned off the flashlight and pressed himself against the cold wall, straining to hear. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, as if someone was searching for him. Then they stopped. A narrow escape. Wilkins held his breath, every nerve on edge. Whoever was above him had paused near the trapdoor. A shadow moved across the faint light seeping in from above. The trapdoor creaked open slightly, and Wilkins braced himself, gripping a loose piece of wood from the floor as a makeshift weapon. But just as quickly as it had opened, the door slammed shut. Wilkins waited in silence for what felt like an eternity before slowly climbing back up. The church was empty. The intruder was gone, but they had left behind a chilling reminder, a fresh footprint in the dust near the trapdoor, matching the pattern Wilkins had seen outside David's house. A fractured timeline. As Wilkins stepped out into the sunlight, he felt the weight of the photograph in his pocket. The mystery surrounding David's family, the man in the black coat, and the church fire were all pieces of a puzzle that seemed to stretch further than he'd imagined. He knew this was no longer just about helping a scared boy. This was about uncovering a dark truth that had been buried for years, one that someone was willing to go to great lengths to protect. Before leaving, Wilkins took a deep breath and looked back at the church. It stood as a silent guardian of secrets he was determined to uncover, no matter the cost. Judge Wilkins spent the evening poring over the photograph and note he had found in the church. The man in the picture, unmistakably David's father, seemed to be staring at him with an expression that felt both pleading and foreboding. The note, "Trust no one. He's watching," gnawed at Wilkins' mind. Who was watching? And why? The timeline of events didn't add up. David's father had vanished nearly 10 years ago, well after the fire. What connection could he possibly have to the church or the mysterious figure in black who had been haunting the boy? A connection unveiled. Wilkins decided to investigate further, starting with Old Town records. The next morning, he visited the local archives, a dusty, dimly lit building that seemed forgotten by time. Rows of crumbling papers and faded photographs stretched before him like a maze of lost stories. After hours of searching, he found an article from 2 decades ago detailing a community effort to rebuild after the fire. The article listed volunteers, and one name caught his eye: Daniel Carter. Daniel Carter was David's father. Wilkins leaned back, stunned. Not only had David's father been involved in the aftermath of the fire, but he had also been listed as a key organizer for restoring the church. Yet no one had ever mentioned this connection. The discovery raised more questions than answers. If Daniel Carter had been so instrumental in the rebuilding efforts, why had his name vanished from the town's collective memory? The warning call. Just as Wilkins was beginning to piece things together, his phone rang. The number was unknown, but he answered cautiously. "Judge Wilkins," a deep voice said. "You're treading on dangerous ground." Wilkins felt his stomach tighten. Who is this? "Someone who knows what happened to that boy's father," the voice replied. "But if you keep digging, you might not like what you find." The line went dead. Wilkins stared at his phone, his mind racing. This was no coincidence. The photograph, the hidden chamber, and now this warning, all pointed to something bigger than a single missing person. A visit to David. Determined to learn more, Wilkins decided to visit David and his grandmother again. This time, he brought the photograph with him. When he showed it to David, the boy's eyes widened. "That's my dad," he exclaimed. "Where did you find this?" Wilkins explained about the church and the chamber, careful not to frighten David. The boy's grandmother, however, grew visibly uneasy. "I told you not to go digging into this, Judge," she said, her voice trembling. "There are things about this town better left buried." "What things?" Wilkins pressed. She hesitated before finally speaking. "Daniel was a good man, but he got involved with people. People who didn't want the past to come to light. When he tried to expose them, he disappeared." "Expose what?" Wilkins asked, his patience thinning. The grandmother shook her head. "I don't know. All I know is that it started with that fire. And the man in black, he's not just in David's dreams. He's real." The shadow returns. As night fell, Wilkins left the house with more questions than answers. The streets were eerily quiet, and the air felt heavy with anticipation. As he approached his car, he felt a presence behind him. He turned sharply, but saw nothing. The shadows seemed to move, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Wilkins shook his head, trying to dismiss the paranoia. But as he drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. A growing web of secrets. Back at his house, Wilkins spread out all the evidence he had gathered so far. The photograph, the note, the article, and his notes from the visit with David's family. One thing was becoming clear. This was no ordinary case of a missing father. The man in black was more than just a nightmare. He was connected to the fire, to Daniel Carter's disappearance, and perhaps to something even more sinister. And if the warning call was any indication, Wilkins was now a target too. Judge Wilkins couldn't shake the sense of being watched. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound too deliberate. That night, as the wind howled outside his home, he resolved to continue digging despite the risks. A secret unearthed. The next morning, Wilkins returned to the church with a flashlight and a crowbar. This time, he was determined to leave no stone unturned. Beneath the loose floorboards in the hidden chamber, he discovered a small, rusted safe. It took considerable effort to break it open, but inside lay a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed with age. The entries were meticulous, written in an elegant but hurried hand. Names, dates, and dollar amounts filled the pages, accompanied by cryptic notes. Payment for silence, cleansing crew expenses, Daniel Carter's advance, final. Wilkins froze. The ledger wasn't just a record of transactions. It was evidence of a deeply entrenched conspiracy. Daniel Carter's name appeared multiple times, always tied to substantial sums of money. But the final entry next to his name chilled Wilkins to his core. Debt settled. Removed. Unwelcome visitors. As Wilkins absorbed the implications, he heard footsteps echoing in the church above. His pulse quickened. He quickly hid the ledger in his coat and extinguished his flashlight. The footsteps grew louder, closer. He peeked through a crack in the floorboards and saw two men dressed in dark suits. They scanned the room with sharp eyes, one holding a crowbar, the other a gun. "They've been here," one of the men muttered, pointing to the disturbed floorboards. "Find whatever they took." Wilkins held his breath as the men began searching. His hiding spot was precarious, and if they found him, there would be no escape. But after several tense minutes, they left empty-handed, their frustration evident. A sudden revelation. That evening, Wilkins pored over the ledger in his locked study. One name appeared repeatedly alongside Daniel Carter's, Councilman Elliot Grayson. Grayson was a powerful figure in Crestview's political scene and a staunch opponent of any changes to the town's leadership. Could Grayson have orchestrated the fire? Was he behind Daniel's disappearance? The pieces were starting to align, but Wilkins needed proof. As he examined the ledger further, he noticed one entry marked with a symbol he had seen before, the same symbol engraved on the wall of the hidden chamber. It wasn't just a random marking. It was a crest belonging to a secret society that had long been rumored to control the town from the shadows. David's nightmare returns. Meanwhile, At his grandmother's house, David woke up screaming. The man in black had appeared in his dreams again, this time speaking directly to him. "Tell your new friend to stop," the figure growled, "or he'll meet the same fate as your father." David's grandmother held him close, her own fear barely concealed. She decided to call Wilkins immediately, urging him to come over. A tense confrontation. Wilkins arrived at the house to find David visibly shaken. When the boy described his dream, Wilkins' blood ran cold. The man in black wasn't just a figment of David's imagination. He was a messenger, a threat. "It's time we fight back," Wilkins said firmly, his resolve hardening. "But we need to be careful. These people will stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden." David's grandmother reluctantly agreed to share more about the night Daniel disappeared. She revealed that he had left the house in a hurry after receiving a mysterious phone call. He never returned, but shortly after, she found a letter in his handwriting hidden under his mattress. The letter read, "If anything happens to me, the answers lie where the fire began." Wilkins realized he needed to return to the site of the old fire, a place no one dared to go after dark, foreshadowing the twist. As Wilkins prepared for his next move, the shadows outside his window seemed darker than ever. Someone was watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. Unbeknownst to him, Councilman Grayson had already been informed of the ledger's discovery. "If Wilkins wants to play hero," Grayson said to his associates, "we'll give him a story he'll never forget." The stakes were rising, and the battle between truth and deception was about to reach its boiling point. Judge Wilkins arrived at the charred remains of the Carter family's old home just as the sun began to set. The property had been abandoned for years, overtaken by wild grass and creeping vines. Its skeletal frame stood like a ghost, a grim reminder of the tragedy that had claimed Daniel Carter's life, or so everyone believed. The air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Wilkins held a flashlight in one hand and the ledger in the other, its damning evidence guiding him toward the answers he sought. Clues in the ruins. Wilkins combed through the rubble carefully. The house's foundation had long since crumbled, but one corner remained intact. It was there, near what used to be the basement, that he found something unusual, a metal hatch partially concealed beneath debris. Using a crowbar, he pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. A chill ran down his spine, but he pressed on. At the bottom of the stairs was a small, concrete room. On the far wall, a phrase had been etched into the stone. "The truth lies beneath the ashes." Wilkins shone his flashlight around and spotted a box buried in soot. Inside were photographs, documents, and a tape recorder. As he inspected the items, he realized they were evidence of the conspiracy he had uncovered. A detailed account of bribes, threats, and even murders linked to Crestview's elite. An ominous discovery. The last photo in the box stopped Wilkins cold. It was a picture of Daniel Carter standing beside Councilman Grayson, both shaking hands. But Daniel's expression was tense, his smile forced. The date on the back of the photo was just 2 days before the fire. Then he noticed something even more disturbing, a figure lurking in the background of the photo. It was the man in black from David's nightmares. Before Wilkins could process the implications, a voice behind him shattered the silence. "You should have stayed out of this." A deadly encounter. Wilkins turned to see 2 men blocking the staircase. Both were armed, their expressions cold and calculating. "Judge Wilkins," one of them sneered, "you're meddling in affairs that don't concern you. Hand over the ledger and whatever else you found." Wilkins' mind raced. He knew he couldn't let them take the evidence, but he also knew he was cornered. "You think killing me will stop the truth?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear creeping in. The second man smirked. "No one will believe you, even if you live long enough to tell the story." At that moment, Wilkins noticed a small ventilation shaft behind him. It was a tight fit, but it might be his only chance. A narrow escape. Feigning compliance, Wilkins slowly placed the box on the ground. As the men approached, he grabbed a piece of broken wood and swung it with all his might, striking one of them in the leg. The man crumpled with a cry of pain. Wilkins didn't wait to see the second man's reaction. He dove into the shaft, crawling as fast as he could while bullets ricocheted around him. The tunnel led him out to a hidden exit near the edge of the property, foreshadowing the twist. As Wilkins emerged into the night, clutching the evidence tightly, he realized the conspiracy went deeper than he had imagined. The man in black wasn't just a harbinger of fear. He was part of a larger, more sinister network. Unbeknownst to Wilkins, Councilman Grayson had been watching the entire encounter through a live feed. "Let him run," Grayson said to his accomplices. "He's only scratching the surface of what we're capable of." The stakes were higher than ever, and Wilkins knew he had to act fast. The town wasn't just harboring secrets. It was sitting on a powder keg of corruption, waiting to explode. A safe haven or a false sense of security. Judge Wilkins, drenched in sweat, navigated the desolate backroads leading to the outskirts of Crestview. His trembling hands gripped the steering wheel as his headlights illuminated the eerie, abandoned landscape. The secluded motel he chose as a refuge loomed in the distance, its neon vacancy sign flickering ominously like a warning beacon. He checked in under a false name, using cash to avoid leaving a trail. Inside the dimly lit room, he barricaded the door with a chair and inspected the windows, ensuring no prying eyes could see in. The air was stale, thick with the smell of mildew and something metallic. The single lamp on the nightstand flickered, casting warped shadows across the room's peeling wallpaper. Wilkins spread the evidence on the bed, a chaotic collection of photographs, documents, and the tape recorder. He stared at it all, the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. Every item on that bed was a death sentence if it fell into the wrong hands. Piecing together a grim puzzle, Wilkins pressed play on the recorder, Daniel Carter's gravelly voice crackling to life. "If you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it out. Grayson and his people, they'll stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But the truth is all here. The fire wasn't an accident, and neither were the others. They'll come for you too, but you must expose them. Don't let them win." The recording ended abruptly, leaving Wilkins staring at the device in stunned silence. His mind raced, replaying the message in his head. He spread out the photos and maps, meticulously studying each one. The map of Crestview, marked with red XS, sent chills down his spine. Each X represented a site of tragic accidents or mysterious disappearances tied to Grayson's power play. The locations told a story of calculated cruelty: burned down homes, missing families, and silenced whistleblowers. At the center of the map was City Hall, circled in bold red ink. But one detail froze Wilkins in place. His own home was marked with an X, dated 2 days in the future. An unlikely ally. Wilkins knew he couldn't fight this battle alone. His mind turned to Officer Jenkins, the one officer who had shown integrity during David's courtroom ordeal. But reaching out to Jenkins was a gamble. If he was part of Grayson's network, Wilkins would be walking into a trap. After hours of deliberation, Wilkins used a burner phone to make the call. The line rang twice before Jenkins answered, his tone cautious. "This is Jenkins. This is Judge Wilkins," he whispered, his voice heavy with urgency. "I need your help, but first, I need to know, are you one of them?" A long pause followed. Then Jenkins spoke, his voice steady but low. "Judge, if you're asking that question, then you already know the answer. Meet me at the old mill in an hour. Bring everything." A dark interception. Wilkins arrived at the mill under the cover of night. The derelict structure loomed ahead, its broken windows glinting like hollow eyes in the moonlight. He parked his car a distance away and approached on foot, clutching the box of evidence tightly. As he reached the entrance, a faint rustling in the bushes stopped him. His heart raced as a shadow emerged. It was Jenkins. "You came alone?" Wilkins asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jenkins nodded, his face grim. "We don't have much time. They know you're here." Before Wilkins could reply, headlights pierced the darkness, followed by the screeching of tires. Black SUVs surrounded the mill, and armed men poured out, their boots thudding against the ground. "Drop the evidence, Judge," a commanding voice bellowed. Grayson stepped out of one of the vehicles, a smug grin spreading across his face. The trap springs shut. Jenkins leaned close to Wilkins. "We're outnumbered. What's the plan?" Wilkins' eyes darted to the mill's crumbling structure. "We buy time." Jenkins nodded and took off, drawing the armed men's attention. Grayson's men pursued him into the shadows, their shouts echoing through the night. Meanwhile, Wilkins slipped into the mill, climbing to the upper level. Inside, he found a rusted ventilation shaft and shoved the evidence inside, praying it would remain undiscovered. As the chaos unfolded below, he took a moment to catch his breath, formulating his next move, foreshadowing the twist. But the night wasn't over. As Grayson's men stormed the mill, a shadow moved silently among them. It was the man in black, his presence unnoticed but deliberate. From his hidden vantage point, Wilkins caught a glimpse of the figure. His heart skipped a beat. He recognized the man from the photograph in Carter's files. The man in black wasn't here to observe. He was here to change the game. The chaos within the old mill deepened as Grayson's men scoured the building. The beams of their flashlights cut through the dust-filled air, creating an eerie glow against the decrepit walls. Wilkins crouched in the shadows of the upper level, his heart pounding as he strained to hear their movements. But amidst the shouting and heavy footsteps, there was something else, a faint sound, deliberate and rhythmic. It was the clicking of boots, calm and measured, echoing from the mill's entrance. The man in black stepped into the dimly lit space. His face remained obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, and his long coat swayed slightly as he moved with unnerving confidence. Grayson's men froze at the sight of him. "Who the hell are you?" barked one of the armed guards. The man in black didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his coat and produced a small device, pressing a button that emitted a piercing, high-pitched whine. The guards clutched their ears in agony, dropping their weapons as the sound overwhelmed them. An uneasy alliance. From his vantage point above, Wilkins watched in astonishment. He leaned closer, trying to get a better view, but the rotting wood beneath him creaked loudly, betraying his position. The man in black turned his head slightly, as if he had known Wilkins was there all along. Without saying a word, he gestured for Wilkins to descend. Wilkins hesitated, glancing at the ventilation shaft where he had hidden the evidence. Was this man a savior or another player in the game? "You don't have a choice," the man in black said, his voice low but commanding. "They'll burn this place to the ground if they don't find you. Come now." Reluctantly, Wilkins climbed down. As his feet touched the ground, the man in black grabbed his arm and whispered, "Do exactly as I say, and you might live through this." The tables turned. Outside, Grayson paced near his SUV, frustration etched across his face. The sounds of gunfire and chaos had stopped abruptly, replaced by an unsettling silence. He barked orders into his radio, demanding updates. Suddenly, the front door of the mill swung open. The man in black stepped out, dragging one of Grayson's unconscious guards behind him. Wilkins followed, his hands raised, pretending to be a hostage. Grayson's face twisted in confusion and anger. "Who the hell are you?" he shouted at the man in black. The man didn't answer. Instead, he tossed the guard's body onto the ground and pulled a small object from his coat, a remote with a single red button. "You have two choices," the man in black said, his voice calm but laced with menace. "You let us walk out of here, or I press this button, and the explosives I planted in the mill will ensure none of us leave." Grayson's smug demeanor faltered. He glared at Wilkins, then back at the stranger. "You're bluffing?" The man in black tilted his head slightly. "Try me." The power shift. Grayson's men began to retreat toward their vehicles, their confidence shaken. Wilkins glanced at the man in black, trying to decipher his endgame. "What do you want?" Grayson growled. "I want you to feel fear," the man replied coldly. "The same fear you've inflicted on this town for years. But tonight, I'm giving you a gift, the chance to walk away. Take it while you can." Grayson hesitated, then signaled his men to back off. The SUVs roared to life, and within moments, the area was clear. As the sound of the vehicles faded, the man in black turned to Wilkins. "The evidence stays hidden. For now. Who are you?" Wilkins demanded, his voice shaking. The man smiled faintly. "Someone who's been watching. You're not ready to face what's coming, Judge." but you will be. Without another word, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving Wilkins alone in the eerie stillness of the night. The twist unfolds. Wilkins retrieved the evidence from the ventilation shaft and drove away, his mind racing. Who was the man in black? Was he truly an ally or another piece of the puzzle? Back at the motel, Wilkins replayed Carter's recording, searching for clues he might have missed. This time, he noticed a faint sound at the end, a barely audible whisper. Trust the shadow, but not the hand that guides it. The cryptic message sent chills down his spine. The man in black had saved him tonight, but Wilkins couldn't shake the feeling that he was now part of a larger, more dangerous game. A sleepless night. Judge Wilkins sat on the edge of the creaky motel bed, the weight of the evidence and the cryptic events of the night pressing heavily on him. The clock on the nightstand ticked steadily, a cruel reminder of the time slipping away. The faint whisper from Carter's tape echoed in his mind. Trust the shadow, but not the hand that guides it. Who was the man in black? And more importantly, could Wilkins afford to trust him? Wilkins turned his attention back to the documents sprawled across the bed. The map of Crestview, with its ominous red XS, demanded action. One detail gnawed at him. The X over his own home, marked for destruction in less than 48 hours. He couldn't run forever. If he didn't act soon, the conspiracy would claim not just him, but everyone he cared about. A fractured alliance. The burner phone buzzed, breaking the silence. Wilkins grabbed it, his pulse quickening. It was Officer Jenkins. "We need to meet," Jenkins said, his tone urgent. "I've got intel on Grayson's next move. This is bigger than we thought." Wilkins hesitated. The events at the mill had left him wary. "Why now, Jenkins? How do I know I can trust you?" There was a pause on the line. "Because if you don't, you'll be dead by morning. Meet me at the old railway depot in an hour." The line went dead before Wilkins could respond. A deadly encounter. Wilkins arrived at the railway depot, a forgotten relic of Crestview's past. The air was thick with the scent of rust and decay, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed in the cavernous space. Jenkins stepped out from the shadows, his expression grim. "Grayson's not just coming for you. He's tying up every loose end. I've intercepted messages about Carter's family. They're next on his list." Wilkins felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Carter's family had already suffered enough. "Then we have to act now," Wilkins said, his voice firm. Jenkins nodded but glanced over his shoulder nervously. "There's something else. The man in black. I've heard rumors about him. They call him the Ghost. He's not a savior, Judge. He's cleaning up his own mess, and he'll use you to do it." Before Wilkins could respond, the sound of heavy boots echoed through the depot. Grayson's men had found them. A desperate escape. The air erupted with the sound of gunfire as Wilkins and Jenkins dove for cover behind a stack of rusted barrels. Bullets ricocheted off the metal, and the acrid scent of gunpowder filled the air. "We're trapped," Jenkins shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Wilkins scanned the area, his mind racing. A ladder leading to the depot's rafters caught his eye. "Up there!" he yelled, motioning for Jenkins to follow. The two men scrambled up the ladder as Grayson's men closed in. From their vantage point, they spotted a maintenance hatch leading to the roof. "Go!" Wilkins urged, giving Jenkins a boost. Just as Wilkins reached the hatch, a figure emerged from the shadows below. It was the man in black. He raised his hand, signaling for silence, and gestured toward an exit Wilkins hadn't noticed before. Wilkins hesitated, torn between trusting the stranger and following Jenkins. "Make your choice, Judge," the man in black said, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "But remember, every path leads to the truth. The question is whether you'll survive to see it." The clock ticks down. Wilkins decided to follow the man in black. Together, they slipped through the hidden exit, leaving Jenkins to fend for himself. Guilt gnawed at Wilkins, but he knew he couldn't save everyone. Outside, the man in black handed Wilkins a flash drive. "This contains everything you need to bring Grayson down," he said. "But exposing the truth will cost you. Are you willing to pay the price?" Before Wilkins could respond, the man in black disappeared into the night, leaving Wilkins alone once more. Back at the motel, Wilkins plugged the flash drive into his laptop. Files and videos flooded the screen, revealing the full extent of Grayson's corruption. But as he scrolled through the data, a chilling realization hit him. There were files on him, too. Unmasking the puppeteer, Judge Wilkins stared at the screen, the glow of the laptop casting harsh shadows across his weary face. The files on the flash drive painted a damning picture, not just of Grayson, but of an entire network of powerful figures manipulating Crestview from the shadows. Among the files was a video labeled Wilkins_connection.mp4. His trembling hand moved to click on it. The footage showed a younger Wilkins at a charity gala, shaking hands with Grayson and other prominent town leaders. Their conversation, though muffled, ended with laughter and a toast. Wilkins' heart sank. This would be enough to incriminate him in the eyes of the public, even if his intentions had been innocent. A note accompanied the video. Every puppet needs strings. Expose the truth, and they'll cut yours. Choose wisely. A growing divide. The burner phone buzzed, jolting Wilkins from his thoughts. It was Jenkins again, his voice frantic. "Judge, where are you? They're closing in on your location. We need to regroup." Wilkins hesitated. The footage on the drive suggested a new player in the game, someone who wanted Grayson exposed but was also willing to burn Wilkins to do it. Could Jenkins be part of this deeper conspiracy? "Meet me at the Crestview courthouse," Wilkins said, his voice steady. "It ends tonight." The courthouse showdown. Wilkins arrived at the courthouse, his steps echoing through the empty halls. He chose the judge's chambers as the meeting point, its familiarity offering a strange sense of comfort. Jenkins arrived moments later, a gun tucked discreetly in his holster. "You sure about this, Judge?" he asked. Wilkins nodded and placed the flash drive on the desk. "This has everything, Grayson, the network, even me. If we're doing this, we're doing it right." Before Jenkins could respond, the chamber doors burst open, and Grayson strode in, flanked by armed men. "Impressive work, Wilkins," Grayson sneered. "You always were the moral compass of this town. Two bad compasses can be broken." A betrayal revealed. Grayson turned to Jenkins. "Good work, officer. Leading him right into my trap was no easy task." Wilkins' blood ran cold as Jenkins smirked. "You always did underestimate me, Judge. You thought I'd risk my life for some lost cause." Wilkins clenched his fists. "You sold out this town for what? A promotion? Money?" Jenkins laughed. "For survival. Something you clearly don't understand." As Grayson's men moved to seize Wilkins, the room went dark. The sound of shattering glass filled the air, followed by muffled grunts and the dull thud of bodies hitting the ground. The ghost strikes again. When the lights flickered back on, Grayson's men were sprawled on the floor, unconscious. Standing in the center of the room was the man in black, his piercing gaze fixed on Grayson. "You've played your part long enough," the man in black said, his voice icy. Grayson staggered back. "You! This was never part of the deal." The man in black stepped closer, pulling a small device from his pocket. He pressed a button, and a hidden speaker crackled to life, broadcasting Grayson's voice from a secret recording. "I don't care how many lives it costs. As long as the town stays under control, the ends justify the means." Wilkins stared at the man in black, realization dawning. "You're not just exposing Grayson. You're dismantling the entire network." The man in black nodded. "And you're going to help me finish the job. The cost of truth." Grayson was hauled away, but not before delivering a parting shot. "Expose me, and you expose yourself, Wilkins. You'll lose everything." The man in black turned to Wilkins, his expression unreadable. "He's right. If you release this evidence, your ties to him will ruin you. But if you don't, the town stays in darkness. The choice is yours." Wilkins looked at the flash drive, then at the man in black. "Why me? Why are you helping?" The man in black smirked. "Because everyone deserves a second chance. Even you." Wilkins took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. "Then let's finish this." As the sun rose over Crestview, the evidence was leaked to every major news outlet. The fallout was immediate and devastating, not just for Grayson, but for Wilkins as well. His career was over, but the town had a chance to heal. And as he walked through the streets, now free of the shadows that had plagued them for so long, Wilkins felt a sense of peace. For the first time in years, he was no longer running. Crestview woke up to a flurry of headlines exposing the depth of Grayson's corruption and the network's sinister grip on the town. News vans lined the streets, and reporters swarmed City Hall. The leaked evidence was damning. Accounts of embezzlement, arson, and even disappearances tied to Grayson and his allies. As the story broke, the townspeople began gathering in the town square, their voices growing louder with each revelation. Wilkins stood at the edge of the crowd, his face obscured by a hood. He watched as people read the headlines and whispered to one another, anger and determination spreading like wildfire. But it wasn't over. Not yet. An unexpected ally. As Wilkins turned to leave, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was the man in black, his expression as inscrutable as ever. "You made the right choice," the man said, his voice low. Wilkins hesitated. "The right choice cost me everything." The man in black shook his head. "Not everything. You still have your life, your freedom, and this town might just remember you for what you did today." Wilkins frowned. "Who are you? Why did you help me?" The man gave a cryptic smile. "Let's just say I have my reasons. And you're not the only one who's lost something to men like Grayson." Before Wilkins could press further, the man disappeared into the crowd, leaving him with more questions than answers. A broken system rebuilt. Later that day, Grayson was arrested, his once confident smirk replaced by a look of utter defeat. His allies scrambled to protect themselves, but the evidence was too overwhelming. One by one, the members of the network fell, their power stripped away. But the victory wasn't without its costs. Wilkins' past connection to Grayson, though minor, had been made public. He resigned from his position as judge, stepping away from the very system he had fought to protect. Yet his resignation sparked something unexpected. The townspeople, inspired by his actions, began demanding reforms. They called for transparency, accountability, and an end to the culture of silence that had allowed the network to thrive. A new chapter for Crestview. Weeks later, Wilkins sat on a park bench, watching children play in the sunlight. For the first time in years, Crestview felt alive. The fear that had gripped the town had been replaced by hope, and Wilkins allowed himself a small smile. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "You've done more for this town than you realize." Wilkins looked up to see Jenkins standing before him, his uniform gone. "I thought you were part of Grayson's network," Wilkins said, his tone wary. Jenkins shook his head. "I wasn't, but I played along to stay alive. When the time came, I made my choice." The two men shared a moment of understanding. "What now?" Wilkins asked. Jenkins shrugged. "We rebuild. Together." The shadow lingers. As Wilkins walked home that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. The man in black's cryptic words echoed in his mind. Who was he? What was his connection to all this? Wilkins paused at his doorstep and turned to look down the street. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a shadow move. Just a trick of the light, he told himself. But deep down, he knew Crestview's battle wasn't entirely over. The man in black's parting words stayed with him. The network is like a weed. Cut it down, and it will grow back. Stay vigilant, Judge. The real fight has only just begun. And with that, Wilkins stepped inside, ready to face whatever came next. Crestview's story is a powerful reminder of the courage it takes to stand against corruption and fight for justice. Judge Wilkins' journey shows us that even when the odds seem impossible, one person's bravery can spark a movement that changes everything. But the fight for truth isn't just fiction. It's a challenge we all face in our lives and communities. What would you do if you found yourself in Wilkins' shoes? Would you take the risk to stand up for what's right? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share how this story resonated with you. If you haven't already, subscribe to Behind the Hate for more gripping stories of resilience and justice. Don't forget to check out our other videos. You won't want to miss the twists and turns we've got in store. Together, let's keep the conversation alive and the truth shining bright. Glowing star.